Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this week's Wine Wednesday virtual wine tasting. My name is Jim Bachman. I'm with the Maryland Wineries Association, and this week we're featuring Rachel Lipman from Loew Vineyards in Mount Airy, Maryland. And we look forward to having a great chat with her. Before I throw Rachel up on the screen and let her take over for this afternoon's presentation, I just wanted to once again remind everybody that Maryland wineries are open for business. While there are limitations to on-premise consumption and enjoying Maryland's wineries in the tasting room setting, you are able to purchase Maryland wine to take home with you and enjoy there. We encourage you to not only enjoy Maryland wine when you're at home, but also think about supporting local Maryland restaurants and maybe make a night of it. You may actually see a push next week from the Maryland Wineries Association and the Restaurant Association of Maryland to embrace all things Maryland wine and food. So we look forward to sharing some more details with you about that. If you have any questions about what's going on with Maryland retail and where you can find Maryland wine, check marylandwine.com, and we have some resources located there. You can also find details on our Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter. Those things are all listed over on the side of the screen there. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this afternoon's chat. This is going to be a fun one. And I'd like to introduce you all to Rachel Lipman. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
Real quickly, for those of you that don't know, Rachel is a third-generation member of her family working on the vineyard here in Maryland, and fifth generation in your family working in a vineyard or on a winery?
In a winery. So basically, my grandfather's family started his family had kind of an empire of honey wineries or meaderies, I guess. Basically evidentiarily, we were able to trace back to about 1870 for our family producing honey wines. And it was very prestigious. My great-grandfather's father had about 9 brothers, and they were all involved in producing or distributing or selling mead. And my grandfather's grandfather is the copy of a label that we still have that shows that it was established in 1870. So if you ask my grandfather, he'll say that our family's been producing wine for centuries. So it would be interesting to see how far back it actually goes, because kind of from what it seems like, we've all, each member of the family essentially started their own business in producing mead. They were able to continue the tradition that way. So my, just kind of as a fun introduction to our family's wine, I have a picture of the old label from 1870. It's in Polish. My grandfather grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you want to kind of figure out, if there's a little bit of a glare, but if you want to figure out exactly what it means, the starry on the top here we go, means aged. So they were aged honey wines, aged meads. Not very sure if they were aged in terms of barrel aging or aged in the bottle. Miod is mead. The Desiroi here means dessert. Malaga means in the sweet style. The M stands for the first letter of my grandfather's first name. The Loew is low. That was it's the Polish spelling for low. The A is kind of like an apostrophe S. That's how they show or determine possession. And then down here means established in 1870. And then here is Bursten, which means the town that it was produced in, which it was basically in the province of Galicia in that area. But Bursten also actually means amber. And if you think about a lot of European cities or areas, a lot of times they were named after things that they were rich in. So for example, they had a lot of amber in that area. That's where Baltic amber essentially comes from. So it's really cool. Anytime a customer comes into the winery and they ask about our history, I try to show them a picture of the label and decipher it, just because it is a really special part of our heritage, and it's unique. I mean, not very many people can say that they have had a winery in their family, whether spanning 2 continents, I guess, in 2 different countries, but have a winery in their family for at least 5 generations worth. So we always have at least one mead or honey wine in our tasting lineup. Today I have 2 because I really enjoy them. They're really fun to make. They're very sticky. It's a whole process. It makes a more complicated harvest, but they yield really interesting wines for us. So I guess I'll start with the first wine. The first one I have is called Apples and Honey. Other side. There we go. And Apples and Honey is a sizer. If you're familiar with the term mead, it's essentially an umbrella term where the way that you make mead is fermented honey, and it's honey, water, yeast, and nutrients essentially. So you can ferment it all the way down. Basically, with this, instead of using water, we use apple cider. And apple cider gives it a little bit more acidity. It calms down the sweetness of the honey while still allowing it to have an extra dimension. We try to keep all of our the wines that we make all local, so local as into Maryland. So the apples that we purchased were actually from an apple cider from McCutcheon's, and then the honey was from a really cool apiary called Apex, and they're located kind of outside of Baltimore. What we did actually was really interesting because normally we make our meads more in that semi-sweet category. This one, we tried it out of the tank, and we actually really loved it dry. So it's not very often that you see a dry sizer. A lot of times people, when they try it, they think that they've never tried anything like it before. It does have a little floral component from the honey. So it's essentially kind of similar to a dry apple wine, but with a little bit more of a floral component and a lot of fun, racy acidity, kind of like a Sauvignon Blanc. My mom loves this wine. This is her go-to. She loves New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and we just can't make wine like that in our property in terms of with the acidity as Sauvignon Blanc being in Maryland. So this is the closest thing to it because it kind of hits her right on her jawline with the acidity right here, and it makes her mouth water. And she always tells us that we can't change it, and so we won't. We'll have a dry one for her. So it's really fun. Actually, a lot of people who say they don't like wine and they only like sour beers tend to go for it. It doesn't have like too much acidity, but it doesn't remind people, or it doesn't remind those people who about like typical white wines, because it has that the apple character being from apple cider. And we don't really filter it either. We tried filtering it, and it took out a little bit of that flavor that we really look for. And so we keep it mostly unfiltered, and it's pretty tasty. Yeah, nice and dry.
It's interesting that you say that people who tend to gravitate maybe towards like a sour beer would appreciate that, but I guess the dry finish on the palate is probably one of those driving characteristics. And you were saying there's a little bit of that tart pucker in the back of the jaw.
Yeah, I think that definitely. I don't think it's like the concept of it being a sour. It's not sour. It's not a sour wine, but I think it's more of the concept that it doesn't, because it's made out of apples, it doesn't have that typical like Sauvignon Blanc like aromatic, or like Chardonnay aromatic, or the grape wine aromatic that sometimes throws people a little off if they only really like beer, because it's kind of similar to some people of like a cider but in wine form. but it has like that floral note with the honey. It's 2 parts wildflower and 1 part clover honey. So I think that's why it just appeals, because it's atypical and it's different. And a lot of times, most people who try wines and are familiar with wines, they're very much I'd say the average person is very much affiliates wine with the noble varieties of Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Pinot Grigio, and when you have something that's not even in that realm, it's pretty surprising. So, and this is atypical even for mead. Since it's it's dry, so it's a fun wine, definitely. I enjoy it. My grandfather and my grandmother really enjoy it too. So, we'll keep making it.
There definitely is a tendency, I think, for some meads that people experience either out in retailers or at events where you may come across mead, because it was definitely the height of popularity at one point, and it seems to be something that's a little bit more nuanced and niche now. But a lot of people, I think, have always experienced or thought they experienced meads as like a very cloying tasting product, not something that is extremely palatable and nice and almost refreshing, I'm sure, with that nice dry palate.
It's really interesting because once, I think after my first year of making mead with my grandfather and my grandmother, I had a very strong interest in learning about the history of mead, especially from where my grandfather is from. And there's really no information. Basically, between World War I and World War II, every single honey winery was demolished besides one. There's only one that's still standing. They didn't even start as a winery. They started actually as a cooperative to establish relationships between the wineries and the apiaries. It's called Apis, I think. They're in Lublin, Poland. And the interesting thing is that there is no information. I tried finding out like what equipment looked like. I heard a bunch of stories from my grandfather and his remembrance of what the winery looked like, and I wanted to kind of just see a picture just to connect the auditory with the visual. And I contacted a historian actually. There's only one brochure, and the brochure is 86 pages long. And it explained all the different types of mead that was produced in that area. It didn't give any pictures besides maybe 2, and they're very small pictures, but it gave a really detailed explanation as to what meads were made at that time, what classification each of them was suited in. It was a very prominent form of alcohol in the area where my grandfather lived, and so prominent and so prestigious that it actually had a classification system, from what it seems like, almost more complicated than the French wine system. And after the Second World War, the consumption of mead obviously dropped because all the meaderies were demolished essentially. And now, in that area, only 13% of the population actually consumes it. So it's really kind of an interesting thing to me, because back then they were making dry meads, they were making sweet meads, they were making fruit blended meads, they're making meads that were aged for 3 years, 5 years in the bottle, and having a certain classification for that. So I think a lot of times what we see in the U.S. is we get certain influences from different areas of the world, and I think a lot of the influence we get with mead is unfortunately the stereotype of like the Renaissance Festival. So that's where we get the cloying, sweet honey wines. And so people think, okay, well, this is what all mead tastes like. And actually, besides the medieval Renaissance time and the Vikings, there was a whole entire way of making mead. Even in Morocco, it's dry. So it was really interesting for me to learn about, to explore, and realize that we're just not able to see or understand everything that was available. And so it's cool for me to be able to showcase honey wine in a way that's atypical, but still has historical value. So even our other mead that we make is not even that dry. It's a semi-sweet, semi-dry, because we want it to be balanced. I mean, that's the main thing. But it's a very cool history. I've done a lot of research about it, and I'm hoping to continue to do more.
Well, it's really cool that you have done so much research about this this beverage that kind of set the course for generations of your family. I mean, that's a really cool story to tell, and to be able to understand and appreciate the roots of that are interesting. It's refreshing to hear somebody of our generation who's that tuned into what happened before and what made that all possible. I also think as mead grows in popularity from Maryland manufacturers, it's going to be very nice to see how your approach to mead at Loew Vineyards is going to differ from the approaches of maybe some of our other manufacturers. And I think that will be really cool, because it's going to give the consumer a lot of options to try this historical drink.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, there are meads that are being produced in that very like sweet, cloying kind of, character. There's ones that are like produced more in the dessert wine category. Then there's and there are some that are being produced like as beer, which is interesting also. There's so many different ways of producing it. And when I was actually doing the research with that whole brochure, I actually I had to Google translate the whole thing. So I spent probably a couple of weeks like copying and pasting and from Polish to English. But anyway, it was really cool to know that wine there was actually considered just like a normal drink, not for an occasion of just for dessert, not for an occasion of like an aperitif, but also for like different parts of the meal. Actually, fun fact, if you go to Eastern Europe, where the area where my grandfather is from, and actually what they did that, during the time that he was there also, if you go into any of those restaurants, what they'll do, or restaurant, pub, whatever, they'll hand you a little shot glass of mead, and you have to say Prost and like cheers to our heroes, of anyone who's fought for us before, and it's kind of just like a tribute to the country and the culture. And I thought that was really cool, because it's not just vodka, it's with mead. And most speakeasies now, actually, I did some like travel research just to see, and that's what they do, is when you go in and you have to say a password, and then they give you a shot of mead. And so it'll be cool to see a resurgence of mead drinkers, and we keep it in a lineup, so it's not just people drinking mead. They're drinking it throughout our whole entire wine tasting lineup. So it is like any other type of wine, but it has a very historical significance to us.
That's awesome. I'm like a history nut, and I really find that kind of stuff to be it's really easy to approach, and it makes the story so much more valuable when you're sitting there tasting the wines and tasting the meads that you're making.
Right.
You have your roots there, and people can experience that. I like that tangibility. That's cool.
Thanks. A lot of pride.
So you said that you have two meads in the lineup, and you're going to touch on both of them today. Have you thought about expanding that part of the portfolio for the family's winery?
Yeah, so we actually are changing our barrel program a bit this year. And with that, we'll be increasing the amount of space we'll have for our honey wines. My goal is to kind of make basically make three. So we have an apples and honey, so a sizer and a piment, and then one that's kind of elevated. We're getting some. We usually use neutral barrels for aging our meads or piments, and I would like to see a third use barrel or second use, where it just imparts just a little bit, like a tiny bit of character, just to round it out a little bit more. Because right now, I mean, the one that I have today to taste is it's a new release because we had run out of the one that we had gotten the Jack Allen Award with. And they're both beautiful wines. They kind of remind me a little bit of Ausley's. I think a lot of times when people try our pine mints, they don't expect them to taste the way they do. They expect, the really sweet honey forward wines. And this one to me is kind of like an entry level. It's not like a Trockenbeer and Auslese, which is, the really heavy dessert wines. It's much lighter and it's a little silkier. So it would be cool to see one step up to bring it a little bit more complex, I guess. So that's my project. I haven't really told my grandparents yet. So if my grandmother's listening, she probably heard me mention it a bit. But I mean, we're gonna have an extra barrel for it anyway. So it would be fun to see, how it all ties together.
So if you're watching this, you just got an exclusive drop from Rachel. The creative cat is out of the bag, and there are some really cool things happening.
Yeah, we have a lot of, there's a lot of fun stuff that we're having the works for this year, and I think for the next 3 years. We've had a lot of changes, I think, in this past year already, and I think, the more that people will come to visit us, they'll see more focus on our history, which I think is so important. To me, that's just, we live, eat, and breathe. Sorry, that's the phone. My grandmother will get that. We live, eat, and breathe the fact that, we have such a unique history, and I think it'll be really important and cool for people to see it as well, because we don't always mention it, and then people are like, I didn't know this, you guys had this history, and I think it'll be really cool for people to learn about it.
Well, and your history just keeps getting more rich here in Maryland, so that's also an incredible part of the story. All right, So what do you think? You ready to move on to another wine? Is there any kind of... Well, let me ask a question while you're pouring that one.
Okay.
What type of unique equipment do you have to use at the winery that you may not find in another winery to manufacture these honey wines?
So it's actually really funny. My grandfather had a friend that rigged a keg with a heating element. So basically, it's the most old school way that I think you can do, besides the old school ways in the old area where my grandfather's family was making mead. The fun thing is, and I would really love to recreate this at some point. I don't know how to do that, and I have to figure that out, because that's why I really wanted to see a picture. Was my grandfather said that the way that his family made mead was the only translation is as a cauldron, but it's not a cauldron actually. It's like this copper. It's like it kind of curves up a little bit. It's a little concave or convex, whatever it is, and it's heated with coals, and then around it is like a little brick wall, and men would walk around it with these long ladles, and they used raw honey, literally with the hive still attached, and they would push the wax, they would push the honey in, and then they would pull the wax out with a ladle. So I think that would be the coolest thing to try to do. I don't think that would be possible at the moment. I have to figure out how exactly they did that. But regardless, they still heated up the honey, which is what you do to make mead. But we use a old school heated element rigged keg, and we use a wooden paddle. And I think there's some meaderies that probably use larger heating elements, or I don't know. I actually haven't seen what other meaderies do, what they do, but we use a keg, and it's pretty old school, and it works, and it's pretty fun, actually. I think it'd be cool for people to see what it looks like, but it's in the winery, so not today. But it's very hands-on. We do everything by hand. So if you can think it's done by hand, it's done by hand here.
Well, I'm glad that there's such a custom-built specialty tool being used to make this fabulous honey wine. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, it's the first time I saw it, I thought it was something that was just manufactured generally, and my grandparents said that it's a friend rigged a keg with a heating element, and um, it works fine. So it's actually gives us a lot of control on the temperature since it's smaller. It's I think it's a 15-gallon keg, 7 or 15. I think it's 15 gallons. So
Yeah, if it's a standard beer keg, 15 gallons would make sense.
yeah.
It's interesting. So homebrewers a lot will use these things that they call kegels, and they'll actually use a keg with a burning element underneath it. And
Okay.
one of the fears is that that stainless steel, if you're not watching how you're heating well, you can end up scorching the bottom of the vessel pretty badly. So I'm sure that they've worked those kinks out over time.
Oh yeah, I mean we have it where it's not necessarily on the bottom, but we have this very careful way of stirring the mead with the honey, and you have to pour it in a specific rate, and it's very controlled. You know, my grandfather says like one thing at a time, so we do everything pretty slowly, so to make sure it's done right. But yeah, I can understand why people would do this, would get a scorching or, you know, kind of boiling character out of a heating element with it. But it's very, very careful. It's like if anybody else helps, we're like, I have to be the one who stirs, or they have to do it so slowly. So it's definitely a learning experience.
Alrighty. So what is the next wine that you'd like everybody to see?
So this is our Chardonnay. Whoops, here we go. It's just released probably about a month ago. New label. So all of our serious wines or dry wines or semi-dry and semi-sweet wines will probably have this label. It was barrel aged for about 6 months in neutral barrel. So it still has a lot of bright acidity to it. And it was my first exposure to working with Chardonnay, so I was really excited for that. And the nice thing about this label is that because history is so important to us, it kind of gives us a little bit of a snapshot with our history, which I thought was a really important added tool for people to see that we've been producing wine for quite a while. But anyway, so it's thoroughly aged in barrels. It has some really bright kind of green apple notes. Like the first thing that I pick up when I try it is the bright green apple characteristic. There is some tropical fruit. It has a little like white flower note to it as well. But super easy drinking. I think a lot of people who don't like those really, basically a lot of the wines I try from California, I end up saying that they have kind of like this fruit bomb kind of characteristic. And this Chardonnay is a lot leaner. You do get that nice roundness from the barrel, but it's not too in your face. It's not too buttery. There's really very minimal impact from the barrel, and that being because it's a neutral barrel. My grandfather and my grandmother, they like to try wines and drink wines that are not they're not too influenced by the oak, because you're drinking the fruit, not the wine, not the wood. It's not like you're drinking a blender's version of butter and oak mashed together. You're supposed to be drinking the true expression of the fruit, and that's what this is. So Maryland grown, and as I said, whenever we do purchase fruit, it's all local in terms of to Maryland. And I've either had my hands on the vines myself, or they're from some really cool vineyards that we have good relationships with. So,
speaking of hands on the vines yourself, when we were talking earlier, you were telling me that you'd planted hundreds of plants in the last few days.
So we hand planted. Since we're an older vineyard, we don't do the laser planting like a lot of other vineyards do, just because we have all the trellising already in place, like the posts and the wires. So any spot planting that we have to do, or if we're going to be planting a new variety and replacing one, we have to do it by hand. So yeah, we planted about I guess it was 100 vines today. Over the past 3 days, we've done a little over 600, which is not that bad compared to last year. Last year, I felt like I think planting lasted for like 3 weeks. Today we finished planting more of a variety that's new to Maryland, called Zweigelt, which is an Austrian variety. So it goes along with our heritage, and it's a variety that my grandparents and I really adore, from trying a lot of examples from Austria and also actually from Pennsylvania. And we're really excited about it. So we were just filling in some holes from, we got all the vines that we were able to get last year from the nursery. And so we weren't able to get everything. So this year we were able to get just 50 more. So that's what we did today. And we have a new Cabernet Franc block now too. So we finished planting that this morning. So lots of fun stuff. Most of our vineyard half of our vineyard is old, as in most of the vines of that half are about 38, 39 years old. So pretty old for Maryland. And then the rest is either in their second year, and then there's some that are now just planted this year. So there's some pretty gnarly looking chancellor vines that we have in the vineyard.
Well, that's great that you're adding some new grapes to the lineup and some things that you guys have a kind of like a personal preference for, that you're going to be able to start showcasing in the coming years.
Yeah, it's one thing to know that it tastes good in other areas. It's another thing to see how it's going to do here. It took a lot of digging to figure out if it would be a variety that would even grow well here. And I think, from trying the examples in Pennsylvania and seeing what issues they had with the variety there, and seeing how we could do things a little bit differently, or knowing what our elevation is here, it's definitely promising. So just, hoping for no more frost so we can keep them healthy.
Usually at about this time of the conversation, I like to say hello to a few people in our comments section that are viewing. Judy Crow, president of the Maryland Wineries Association and co-founder of Crow Vineyards, is on. Hi, Judy. And I also see Regina McCarthy with Doden Vineyards in there, so if she's still watching, hi, Regina. They both said hello and are both very interested in kind of your talk about the apples and honey and the sizer idea and that whole thing. So great work, and keep it up.
Thanks. That means a lot from them.
Sorry, I did not lose you. I'm tinkering around with the display a little bit. So the Chardonnay sounds lovely. Sounds very delicious. Did I hear you say it has a note of white flower? Were you talking like floral white flower, or white flower as in baking flour?
Oh no, floral.
Okay.
Floral.
I was trying to figure that out because I heard it and I wasn't sure.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I didn't think about that. That makes sense. Yeah, white flowers is in like I can't think of a white flower right now, but that shows you how fried your brain gets from being outside for too long. But yeah, it just kind of like a dainty floral characteristic. I think definitely not like people. It's gluten free. It's gluten free.
I was going to say that does not sound like the most appealing description, but if that's what you guys are going with, then
yeah, it's gluten free. There's no flour.
So maybe it conjures up the visual that you would have thinking of like a nice clear spring day or something floral like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense to me. Thank you.
Honeysuckle note to it, something where it for me, whenever I think of wines, I think of like a memory of, for me, it would be like walking through, there's this area where I grew up, and we would walk to this lake a lot, and it had honeysuckles and a bunch of different like types of wild, like white flowers, little tiny white flowers. And it just reminds me of that like walk we would do around the lake. So that's kind of where that comes from.
I like that very much. That sounds like a lovely description.
It's much better than a bag of flour, which is probably in most stores by now.
Yeah, you could have your hands on a commodity that everybody needs.
Yeah, that's true.
Too bad you went with floral. The answer could have been totally different.
Yeah, I'm sure people would. Well, I'm sure I get the two different edges of that stick, where it'd be the people that are like gluten free that would be really upset that
Sure.
and then there would be some that would want to do something with it. I don't know. So
who knows? All right. So you mentioned a specific grape variety in your conversation there about the vineyard that had some potentially gnarly looking vines. You said Chancellor.
Yeah.
Is that the next wine that you were going to talk about?
Yeah.
Let's go to that.
This is it's a dry red wine. It's really interesting because something that I've noticed with this wine is that when people when people are producing and trying a lot of different types of wines from Maryland, we see a lot of Cabernet Franc and Syrah and some of those noble varieties. And the goal is to extract as much color as you can and have them to be as full bodied as they can. With this wine, I think it's interesting because we don't really have very many varieties that will be similar or like reminiscent to like a Pinot Noir. They could be, but sometimes they're extracted to a point where it's really dark in the glass and they're not as light and fruity. The Chancellor is a dry red that from this vintage, the vines were about 35 years old. So yeah, I guess it'd be 38 now. It's a 2017. And we barrel aged them for about a year. It was barrel aged for about a year in neutral barrel. So mostly just the expression of the fruit. And to me, it's very reminiscent of like a Pinot Noir, like Gamay, or Grenache. It's lighter. It has a bunch of like rose petal. So here's the floral. Rose petal, like pomegranate, like raspberry characteristics, and virtually not a huge amount of tannin. So it's very smooth tannins. So to me, it's not. It's a wine that should be treated like you would be pairing something with a Pinot Noir or like Gamay. And that's kind of an interesting variety for me because we actually, until the 2017 vintage, we really didn't see its true potential, I guess, as a single varietal. It was the first year we ever did it as a single varietal. And I think it really just allowed it to really showcase its true expression. And it was really pretty. I was really excited with it because it was one of the first varieties that I got to work with without a huge amount of supervision. But it's nice and light and I call it like a Wednesday night wine where you're not sure you want to eat, not sure what you're going to drink, but it fills the bill. And it pairs with a lot of different things. Actually, it would pair phenomenally with like a pork belly, anything with really like a nice fat, because it does have some nice acidity. It's a nice food wine, but it's very balanced. It's what you would expect, honestly, of a Pinot Noir that's a little bit more extracted than some Pinots, but it's nice.
And while you're sipping that delicious sounding wine, I would like to give a shout out to my friend Russ Benson, who jumped in and said the word that we're looking for is lilac.
That's valid. I haven't talked to Russ in a while. I hope he's doing good.
Actually, my wife and Russ's wife work together, and from what I've heard, I think that they're doing well.
That's good.
Russ, great to see you in there. Lots of love to you and the family.
Ditto to him. But yeah, so I really, actually, it's kind of funny. I don't think we have a huge amount of the Chancellor left. I think we have about 10, 11 cases. So once this one's gone, we'll be looking for the 2020 vintage, because everyone knows what happened in 2018. we didn't really have a huge crop with it, and same with 2019. So 2020 is looking pretty good for us so far. It's actually looking very good. So I'm hoping for people will see a nice fun wine in 2021.
So mentioning that is a good segue to a couple of questions that I was going to bring up. The first was you're saying that things are kind of looking up for 2020. Did you have any big issues with the cool nights over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, we had some issues with our Foch, which is a very early heritage vine or hybrid. It buds out sooner than most varieties. That one to us is it's a variety that we're going to be looking to. It's a hybrid that basically it'll continue to bud out no matter what. So any damage that it had, we're not too worried about it. I mean, it's already showing a lot more growth in the past like 3 or 4 days after the frost. A little bit of our Chancellor was hit, maybe 5% or under, because it wasn't fully bud out, didn't fully bud out yet. And then varieties like our Cabernet Franc is not fully out yet. Same with the Vidal is still mostly dormant. It's pushing out a little bit. So we'll be okay. But a lot of our vines right now, about 40% of our vineyard is under their second year. So we don't have a huge, so 60% is under normal fruiting, normal fruiting age, I guess. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm hoping that there's going to be no more frost, because that would really suck at this point. But we've been okay so far. If I can sacrifice one variety, I will gladly sacrifice the Foch, because it will come back. But the other ones, we get a little bit more concerned about, but they were a little bit further behind, so they'll be okay.
And are you sourcing all of the honey from apiary on the property, or do you bring the honey in from a local vendor?
Yes, from a local vendor. Nothing is from us. Being such a small business, it's mostly just myself and my grandparents, and the occasional help that we'll hire. And I think the amount of hats that I'm doing, I can't, nor do I really want to work with bees. I'd rather let someone else do that. So we have a producer, Apex, which is they had a location in the Baltimore area, but I think they're more in Caroline County. So and he has a couple of different, to my understanding, a couple of different sites of beehives, I guess. So it's all from Maryland. So I would like to continue to just purchase from him. It's very high quality honey. Actually, we do sell his honey. This is Wildflower Honey. And when we make the meads, there's usually a little bit that we can have left over, that we scrape into little jars. And I think the first time we worked with our honey, I ate about a pint's worth in like 2 weeks. I did dip it with stuff. It's not like I just ate it as a spoonful, although it is healthy for you if you do it a tablespoon a day. But that, besides the fact that it's really high quality honey, it's not filtered, and so we get a lot of the same benefits by working with it.
I was going to ask if you had any idea what the last couple of weeks worth of fluctuating weather would do to honey production with bees, because I don't know much about that.
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I have followed him on Instagram, so from what it seems like, they're still pretty active. But I'm sure dropping down to 26, 27 degrees makes a difference with working with bees. We have them already active on our property, even though we don't source their honey. But there's plenty of honeybees that in the past couple of days, whenever it is above 65 degrees or so, I get them buzzing in my ear. So,
well, when you decide to become a beekeeper, you can answer all these questions.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Well, there is a list of two more wines that I see here. Which one are you going to share with everyone next?
Great.
Now,
So
this wine
yeah,
just did a great thing this year. It was the Jack
well,
Allen
this
winner, right?
new one. So the other one we sold out right
Okay.
after that happened. It just sold really quickly. And that's what happens when you get an award for something. They tend to fly off the shelf. But yeah, I mean, it's actually very similar. So we'll see if it does just as well. But it's more, I think, traditional for us, the pine mints, the meads that are done with grapes, because uh, they're the ones that we tend to have a little bit more often than we do typically the sizers. And I think after producing this sizer, the apples and honey, I think we'll continue to have both of them available and kind of expand that line. But anyway, the honey and grape from this well, you can't put a vintage on honey, but from this vintage of when we harvested the fruit of the grapes, was done with our estate Seyval. So it's actually, Seyval is typically a little neutral, but this was done with also 2 parts wildflower and 1 part clover honey. And then we barrel age it for literally about 12 months in neutral barrels. And then it's about, oops, this is a little pink now. And it's semi-sweet. So the residual sugar is about 2.5%. So it's kind of in that category where it's almost like a Goldilocks wine, where it's not too sweet and not too dry. But it does have a really silky finish. Seyval being a little bit more neutral, it allows the honey to kind of speak for itself a little bit more. So it has a lot of vanilla notes to it, where the previous one that had gotten that really awesome award had a lot more tropical fruit, because it was done with Reliance, and Reliance is like, we actually make a wine of called Serendipity, which is just of Reliance, and it has like this full-on characteristic of day-old pineapple, where it's a little bit sweet, not as acidic, or mango. It depends on the vintage. But anyway, this one is what my grandmother says is it's much silkier and much smoother. And I had a friend who bought it recently, and she sent me a text saying, "Oh my God, this thing is so smooth. It's so good." So I really enjoy it. I think they kind of put a different twist on meads, just because, we've talked about them being usually a little bit syrupy, and this one is kind of in that Auslese category, where it has a viscosity, but it's not going to coat your tongue entirely. So it's really pleasant, and I'm proud of it.
It sounds like you have some fans of honey and grape in the comments too. Roberta's a big fan. She says it's the best.
Cool.
And Carissa just said that the honey and grape she had from you was delicious. So it's awesome. And Chris also said that it's been a while, so it's time to get another bottle and make sure that it's just as good as it was the last time.
Yeah, our meads are always, there was a period of time where we would only produce them like every 3 to 5 years, because they really like lengthen that whole day of producing wine. So basically, what we do is when we harvest the fruit, we let it settle for about a day, and then what we do is we then thin the honey with a little bit of water, and then we heat it up, and then we, I guess, inject it. That's not a good term. Transfer it, I guess that's a better term, into the wine to then start fermenting. And so it makes like what you would have as a normal, 8-hour day. And there was one year, which is the year that we had the one right before this one, I think it was like a 14-hour day. And my snack that day was the lids of the bucket of honey, and I was dipping an apple in it. so now that's my tradition, is every time I make a mead, I have an apple that I just dip into the lid, because that's, we're not going to use it, and it's just for my lunch break. But anyway, so there's usually a period of time where we don't have the meads. That's what I was trying to get to. And with them being such a big part of our history and people really loving them, I think we're going to continue to have them, so that, you know, and they'll be different. Each vintage, quote unquote, is different than from the last one. So maybe I'll do a dry one, who knows, or sparkling. That'd be fun too. But I mean, for right now, the traditional is king.
It does seem like there should be some allowance to be able to call out some sort of marker for when that honey originated, because there's definitely got to be differences in how honey tastes year to year based on what's going on with all of the flowers around and the plants that are being pollinated.
Even bucket to bucket. So we buy them in like 65-pound buckets, or 5 gallons or so. And, you know, between the wildflower, I guess it's an apist, the guy who runs the apiary, he says that, you know, even between bucket to bucket, they have different characteristics. So when I made, my cousin actually helped me this last year making another sizer, and we separated the vats. So they were both, each of them had 2 parts wildflower, 1 part clover, but we tasted each of the clover honey buckets, and they were very different actually. So we wrote that down and knew which vat was which. So one of the vats probably will have more of a vanilla characteristic, and then the other one will have more of like that, like a mandarin orange. And it's just from the differences in the flavor of the honey and even the sweetness level of the honey, because the one that had like a vanilla characteristic had like this awesome like burnt caramel, like vanilla note to it. And then the other one was like, it reminded me of when I was little, and we would have these little cans of these the Dole like mandarin oranges, and it really had a nice like flavor of that. And so because of that, the wine itself is going to have a different note and flavor. So maybe we'll separate them. But it's cool. I mean, we get to see how the honey affects the production of the wine itself, because it basically increases the Brix level. So when we ferment it down to completion, we can see it as a true wine, where otherwise it would have been more of a cider residual, cider alcohol level for the sizers, for example. So it's interesting. I mean, it'll be cool to see what even just all clover compared to all wildflower would taste like. And they usually do taste different. You know, we've done different years of different things like that. So
sounds like another barrel project for you to spring on your grandparents.
Yeah. I can't spring too much on them.
You heard it here first.
There's only so much at a time. You know, we'll see what they say after this.
All right, and I think that we are coming up on the last of the wines that you were going to feature today.
Yeah, so Country Classic is always a fan favorite. I call it a cult wine. It's actually a red wine that we blend with blackberry juice, and Kevin loves this wine. He actually commented on it recently, and I just love it. It's a wine that a lot of people, when they first are getting interested in red wines and they need something with a little bit of sweetness, this is usually the wine that people tend to gravitate towards. And a lot of dry drinkers still love it. So this is the label. So Country Classic is a blend of Chancellor, Foch, and then right before we bottle, we back sweeten with some blackberry juice. There's really, I think it's 3.9%, which accounts for the bottle of blackberry juice. The residual sugar is 3.7, so right at the edge of the semi-sweet category. And it has some complexity because the red wine is barrel aged, but then we have the fruit. Blackberries as a fruit are very prominent, so it's always very popular. It's always one of the first things to go at festivals, and you know, when we run out of it, people get a little upset. We send we get Facebook messages, phone calls, emails, you know, the whole 9 yards. So we have plenty of bulk red wine for it, so that's not going to be a problem for the next couple of years. But yeah, we do get some upset customers, which I understand. It's a good wine. I mean, some of our fruit wines do get they have quite a following. So, but it's blackberries really, wow, very prominent on the nose. That's sometimes I forget how prominent it is. Like I don't typically drink the fruit blended wines. You know, I appreciate them and they have their moments. They're actually very good with goat cheese or like charcuterie. But I usually am in different phases of the meads and like Chardonnay and our Chancellor and wines like that. So whenever I try them again, I always get surprised. Tons of blackberry. And this is a new release of that one too. And it makes your mouth water. So that's another one that my mom would say just hits right here. This is actually the first red wine my dad loved. And a lot of people, when they first get into wine, especially into red wines, it's their entry level. And even after that, I mean, it's always a fond memory. So yeah, I totally forgot how prominent that is on the nose. That's fun. And not too sweet either. So
I've enjoyed this experience over the last several weeks, watching winery operators and owners and winemakers approach these wines that, you know, it's part of your daily routine. You sometimes take it for granted what that product was, you know, and I say product because it is something that's part of a branded lineup for the winery typically. And I don't mean to say that in a way that makes it a commodity. I just say that in a way as like, when you're operating the business of a winery, and I've been speaking to breweries and distilleries, you kind of take some of this stuff for granted. And I like seeing that aha moment where, you know, someone who has a lifetime of experience around these different brands or these different wines gets to appreciate it again after, you know, after a little bit of time away.
You know, it's kind of interesting because, you know, I think being in this industry, you know, we kind of live, eat, and breathe this industry as when you work in it. I mean, you know, winemakers, you know, a lot of people will ask me, do you have any other interests besides wine? And the answer is obviously yes for me. I mean, not obviously, but it is yes. And there are a lot of things I like to do besides being in a vineyard, drinking wine, or working. But it kind of becomes, you know, I think especially with having my family history, it becomes a big part of your identity. And even the wines that you make can surprise you. And I think that the goal of I think the cool thing about doing this series is that people are getting exposed to, even if they're not trying the wines along with the tasting, they're getting exposed to an experience where they're getting to hear from the winemakers. And I just got surprised with my own wine. You know, which was, you know, probably fun for other people to see. And, you know, to kind of see everyone's passion, because every producer, I think, in this industry, especially in Maryland, since we're all so small, we have a big passion for working and enjoying the products that we create and everybody else's products too. So I think it's a really cool thing that we're able to be a part of.
I don't know if you were watching the clock or not, but that was one heck of a way to wrap this up. That was beautifully said. You did a wonderful job with that, and I could not have asked for a better segue to a closing for this thing.
Oh, I didn't even realize.
So let me ask you, how can people get wine from Loew Vineyards right now? I know you guys have a presence in the retail marketplace. I shared some links earlier this week for folks to be able to find your wines at their favorite retailers. But aside from that, what options are there?
So basically, all the retailers that we're in Maryland are the ones that I can drive to, because it is basically, besides just me, it is me and my grandparents. But people can also order online. We have a couple of different options where people can order online, email, or call us and have it ready for pickup. we are working with Loew, which is in Silver Spring, and they're able to help with any home deliveries. So if you want wine the next day and you aren't able to drive over to the winery, you're able to get that. All of our wines that people can buy from us from at the winery come with a complimentary tasting card. So it's like a $20 value, and it basically, we know that life's going to be a little weird after the pandemic is over, but they're going to be able to come and enjoy a complimentary tasting for 2 people. And we do ship out of state as well. So, and I think we're able to kind of do some stuff with in-state. So, you can check our website. We actually just launched our first wine club. There's 2 different tiers. There's one for kind of like the foodie, the dry drinker, and then there's also one for the people who like more of the semi-sweet to sweet wines, and they can check our website for that as well. Yeah, and we'll be doing some fun offerings for Mother's Day. I think one thing that I had an idea of doing that we'll be enacting is for every purchase that's for a mother, we'll be giving little packets of wildflower seeds. So there's flower everywhere. Wildflower seeds, so that you can have throughout a whole season of cutting your own flowers. So it's one thing just to receive flowers. It's another thing to watch them grow, like a mother watches their kids grow. So, yeah.
That's very sentimental and nice. I like to hear that.
That's what we are.
All right. Well, go check out Loew Vineyards at loewvineyards.net. That's vineyards, plural. Loew vineyards.net. Check them out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. They're everywhere. Check out the wine club. Check out the shop online. Figure out how to get their wine in your glass so you can enjoy these wonderful historic stories. This has just been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. For everybody else that's out there, please stay safe. Visit marylandwine.com for any information about how you can support Maryland wineries in this very critical time. And look for us next week. Wineries are open. They want to sell you wine. Pick it up on their curb, get it delivered to your house, ship it out of state to your family, and let them experience Maryland wine, do all this great stuff. And thank you again for tuning in with us on another Wednesday afternoon. Rachel, I look forward to seeing you soon in person. And
yeah, thank you.
Send my best to your grandparents.
I will, yeah, and to you and your family too.
And I would like to say goodbye to everybody. We're going to hit the end button now. See you next week.
See ya.